You're listening to the Night Watch Records. Record entry, 1900. Imagine a jagged tooth of rock rising from the North Atlantic, miles from the nearest Sol. Your only task is to keep the light burning so others can find their way home. But what happens when the light goes out? In December of 1900, 3 men stepped into the silence of the Flannan Isles and never stepped out. We are opening the files on the vanishing at Eilean Moor. Close your eyes. Can you hear the wind calling names that no longer exist? The isolation of Eilean Moor is not a quiet thing. It is a roar. It is a place where the Atlantic Ocean decides the fate of every living thing, crashing against the cliffs with a violence that shakes the very foundation of the earth. In December 1900, 3 experienced keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, arrived on this desolate plateau of rock to begin their watch. They were men used to the solitude of the sea, men hardened by the salt and the spray. Yet even for them, the Flannan Isles held a peculiar heavy stillness between the storms. To live in a lighthouse is to live in a paradox. You are the guardian of the world's most vital light, yet you are completely invisible to the world you protect. You exist in a cycle of mechanical ritual, trimming wicks, polishing brass, and hauling oil, while the horizon stretches out in every direction, a flat, gray line that never moves. As the winter of 1900 deepened, a storm unlike any other began to brew, a tempest that seemed to swallow the islands whole. The logbooks found later spoke of a wind that made even these veteran mariners pray for mercy, a wind that brought with it a cold so sharp it felt like glass. But as the gale shrieked outside their thick stone walls, a much deeper silence was forming within the lighthouse itself. On the night of December 15th, a passing steamer, the Arctur, noted that the great light of Eilean Moor was dark. No beam cut through the spray. No warning was given to the ships navigating the treacherous rocks. It was as if the island had simply ceased to exist. When a relief ship finally fought its way to the shore days later, the silence they found was absolute. The gates were locked, the beds were made, and the clocks had stopped. But the men, the 3 souls tasked with keeping the darkness at bay, were gone, leaving behind a meal on the table and a set of entries in the logbook that suggested the isolation had finally started to whisper back. They were watchers of the rock, but in the end, the rock was the only thing left watching. When the relief vessel Hesperus finally groaned against the landing stage of Eilean Moor on December 26th, the air felt thick, not just with the salt of the Atlantic, but with the suffocating weight of a void. The relief keeper, Joseph Moore, stepped onto the iron ladder with a hollow chest, shouting into the wind, but his voice was swallowed instantly by the spray. There was no flag on the pole, no welcoming call, and most chillingly, no sign of life at the station. As he pushed open the heavy oak door of the living quarters, he entered a world where time had simply frozen. The kitchen was cold, yet a meal sat prepared on the table. Salted meat and potatoes untouched, the chairs pushed back as if the men had risen in a sudden desperate hurry. A canary sat silent in its cage, its tiny eyes reflecting a stillness that shouldn't exist in a place of constant labor. But it was the logbook, lying open on the desk like a confession that turned a simple disappearance into something far more haunting. The entries leading up to the vanishing spoke of a storm so fierce it broke the spirits of men who had spent decades at sea. Thomas Marshall wrote of winds that screamed like banshees, claiming that James Ducat, a man known for his iron resolve, was quiet and somber, and that the third man, the hardened veteran Donald MacArthur, was weeping in the corner of the room. This was the first fracture in reality. On those specific dates, weather reports from the nearby coast of Lewis recorded clear skies and calm seas. There was no storm on the Flannan Isles that week, at least not one that belonged to this world. As Moore read further, the words became more frantic, more detached from the logic of a lighthouse keeper's duty. The final entry, scrawled on December 15th, simply read, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." Yet, when the relief crew inspected the island, they found evidence of a violence that defied a calm sea. On the western landing, massive iron railings were twisted like dry grass, and a supply crate weighing over a ton had been ripped from its moorings and tossed 40 feet into the air. The physical evidence suggested a rogue wave of impossible proportions, a wall of water that had climbed the cliffs to claim the men. But if the sea was calm, as the logbook claimed, what was it that MacArthur was weeping for? What kind of storm moves through a man's mind while the ocean outside remains flat and indifferent? The isolation of Eilean Moor had created a private apocalypse, a localized nightmare where the boundaries between the crashing waves and the psyche of the keepers began to bleed into one another. The lighthouse was perfectly maintained. The lamps were cleaned and refilled with oil, ready to be lit. But the men who tended them had vanished into the very darkness they were sworn to fight. They left behind their oilskins hanging on the pegs, meaning they had stepped out into the freezing wind-lashed night in their shirt sleeves. A suicidal act for any sailor. It was as if something had called to them from the cliffs, a siren song of the void that required them to abandon their posts, their safety, and their sanity, all at once. The logbook remains a silent witness to those final hours, a bridge between the world of the living and the cold, crushing embrace of the North Atlantic, leaving us to wonder if they were taken by the sea, or if they simply walked into the waves to escape a silence they could no longer bear. In the wake of the vanishing, the Flannan Isles did not offer answers. They only offered echoes. The official investigation concluded that a freak wave, a mountain of water born from a distant Atlantic disturbance, must have swept the men away while they were attempting to secure equipment on the treacherous western landing. It is a logical explanation, a cold and scientific end to a terrifying mystery. But logic has a way of dissolving when it meets the salt-cracked logs of Eilean Moor. If the sea was the only culprit, why were the oilskins left behind? Why would seasoned mariners who knew the lethal bite of a North Atlantic gale step out into the teeth of a storm without their protective gear? The silence that followed the inquiry was perhaps more haunting than the disappearance itself. For decades, the legend grew, fueled by the whispers of those who claimed the island was cursed, a place where the veil between our world and something much older was dangerously thin. Some spoke of giant phantom birds, others of ancient spirits that demanded a tithe of 3 souls. But the true horror lies not in the supernatural, but in the sheer weight of the isolation. To be a lighthouse keeper is to be a ghost while you are still breathing. You are a man removed from the timeline of humanity, anchored to a rock that does not care if you live or die. As the years passed, the lighthouse was eventually automated, the flickering oil lamps replaced by cold, uncaring electric beams that require no human hand to trim the wicks. The watch ended in 1971, and the rock was left to the birds in the wind. Yet, sailors passing the Flannans at night still speak of a strange sensation when the light sweeps across the waves, a feeling of being watched by eyes that are no longer there. The tragedy of Eilean Mor serves as the ultimate testament to the fragility of the human mind when it is stripped of its anchors. When you are isolated for long enough, the boundary between the internal storm of your thoughts and the external storm of the world begins to erode. You start to hear voices in the wind and see patterns in the crashing foam. We may never know if James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur were taken by a rogue wave, or if they simply surrendered to a madness born of the deep. Perhaps the god they wrote about in their final entry was the ocean itself, a vast and different deity that finally decided to reclaim the tiny spark of light they had dared to hold against the dark. The file on the Flannan Isles remains open in the mind of every traveler who fears the silence of the sea. It reminds us that there are places in this world where the light doesn't just guide you home, it reveals the emptiness that waits for us when the world stops listening. The night on Eilean Mor is long, and the Atlantic is deep, and some secrets are better left buried beneath the waves. The watch has ended. The lamps are dimming. You are safe now, far from the reach of the spray and the call of the cliffs. But as you drift towards sleep, remember the watchers on the rock and ask yourself, in the absolute silence of the night, what voices would you begin to hear? The entry is complete. The file is locked. Rest now, for the horizon is clear and the tide is receding. Good night.
15th, as well as some barometer and thermometer readings and the state of the wind taken at 9 AM on December 15th, were written on the slate for transferring into the log later. They also noticed that the lamp was crimped, the oil fountains and canteens were filled up, and the light's lens and the machinery were cleaned, which proved that the tasks needed to be completed on December 15th had been completed. The pots and pans had been washed, and the kitchen had been tidied up, which showed that the man who had been acting as cook had completed his work as well. This all suggested that the 3 lighthouse keepers had disappeared after the afternoon of December 15th. Supporting this notion is a report from a captain of a steamer boat. While news spread of the disappearance and the story began to be published in newspapers, a guy named Captain Holman had passed the Flannan Islands in a steamer called the Arcta at around midnight on December the 15th, and he claimed that he could not see the lighthouse. He went on to say that he thought that was strange because he thought that he should have been able to see it, but then for some reason he decided not to report this. Then on December 28th, McCormick then stayed behind at the boat, and Moore went all the way up to the lighthouse, where he found the entrance gate and the outside doors closed. The clock on the wall was stopped, there was no fire lit, and in fact it looked like the fire was not lit for a good couple of days. And then when Moore started searching each bedroom for the lighthouse keepers, all of the beds were empty. And this is about the time that Joseph Moore said to himself, "Hold up, wait a minute, something ain't right." And he ran all the way back down to the boat and told McCormick that some shit has happened here that people are going to still be talking about on YouTube in about 100 years from now. When McCormick asked Moore, "What in the fuck is YouTube?" Moore said that that's not important right now, but you've got to come up to the lighthouse with me and help me look for the keepers. The 2 men went back up to the lighthouse to make sure that Joseph Moore didn't miss anything, and they started thoroughly searching the lighthouse for the keepers, but obviously they found nothing. They then gave up at some point and returned to their boat and then returned. I've got one more theory for the road for you guys, and theory number 8 is based on the psychology of the lighthouse keepers. Now it sounds like it's going to be deep, but it's only a deep pile of dog shit. Allegedly, Donald MacArthur was quite an aggressive guy. He had a reputation for brawling and was known to be quite violent. So it's speculated and theorized, of course, that this may have led to a fight breaking out near the cliff edge by the West Landing that caused all 3 men to fall to their deaths. Now, if we've got no evidence for waves washing the keepers away, why the fuck do we suggest sea serpents, ghosts, and lighthouse UFC as a possible cause? It's crazy, man. Anyway, I feel pretty certain that they were probably washed away while trying to secure some equipment. Exactly how they suggested it happened in the 1900s already. But what do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you again soon with another mystery. Thanks for watching.